Hallowed Tides of the Drowned God. Chapter 3. The Sump-Rat's Path. The air in Grendel Brekker's hideout was thick enough to chew. It tasted of hot ozone from a jury-rigged power distributor that sat humming on a crate, its exposed wires occasionally spitting a tiny blue spark. The usual sump bouquet of rust and damp was there, but beneath it was something else, the dry, sterile scent of scavenged tech and the faint, earthy aroma of the Tide Lord's personal stash of glimmer moss. Jorin sat on a low stool, his elbows on his knees, trying to focus on the flickering schematic Grendel had projected onto a stained bulkhead wall. It was a cross-section of a primary nutrient-paste conduit, a fat artery running through the lower sectors. He looked haggard, the skin under his eyes the bruised purple of a deep-sea fish. He hadn't slept. Sleep was a luxury the whispers no longer afforded him. "Just a little longer, Papa. The water's not so cold." A girl's voice, soft and familiar. No, not now. Jorin squeezed his eyes shut for a second, pushing his daughter's ghost back down. Grendel, oblivious, tapped a claw-like finger on the projected image, his nail clicking against the metal wall. He was a broad, dense man, built like a pressure hatch. Here, conduit junction 7C gamma. It's a nexus point for the nutrient lines feeding 3 lower sump sectors. The spire-borne synth foods get shunted through a secondary line right next to it. More flavorful stuff, real protein derivatives. Jorin grunted, forcing himself to look. The schematic was a dizzying web of pipes and pressure gauges. Normally, he could read it like a child's primer. Now the lines seemed to swim, to twist like pale tube worms in the abyssal heat. "Compliance patrols this sector twice per shift," Grendel continued, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floor plates. "But their logs are a fiction. Their rounds are predictable. The trick isn't avoiding them. It's the internal pressure sensors. Trip one, and the whole junction goes into lockdown. We'd be trapped like Sump-Rats in a flooded barrel." Jorin didn't respond. He was listening to something else, not just to Grendel, not just to the groaning hull of Amphitrite, but to the hum in his own skull. It was a chorus now, a layered static of voices, memories that weren't his. He was the antenna, and the entire drowned world was the broadcast. "Check the gauge. Pressure's dropping. Wrench, need the damned wrench." A man's voice, rough with exertion, irritated. "That's where you come in, welder," Grendel said, turning to face him. The single orange work lamp cast Grendel's shadow across a mountain of scavenged goods, power cells, data drives, filtration cartridges stacked like silver bricks. "You feel the city. You saved half of Sector Beta with that pipe. I'm not asking you to stop a rupture. I'm asking you to find one before it happens. A weak point, an unmonitored access panel, a maintenance cycle they always skip." The request settled in Jorin's gut like a lead weight. This was different. The pipe in Beta, that was an accident, an instinct. This was a choice. To aim this infection like a weapon, to use the ghosts in his head for a black market raid. "I don't know if I can control it," Jorin said, his own voice sounding distant and thin. Grendel let out a short, humorless laugh. "I'm not asking you to control it. I'm asking you to listen. Just listen." Jorin stared at the schematic again. He closed his eyes, letting the thrum of the hideout fade.
He focused on the image of junction 7C gamma, holding it in his mind's eye. He let the whispers come. Always gets stuck, this rust-rotted hinge. Another voice, a woman, tired. Sergeant wants the report by bell change. Just sign it off. No one's checked panel 4 in a cycle. A flicker, a flash of sight. He wasn't in Grendel's hideout anymore. He was looking through another man's eyes, his gloved hand hovering over a data pad. The name on the worksuit sleeve read Kovacs. The air smelled of lubricant and stale nutrient paste. Kovacs glanced at his chrono, 10 minutes left in his shift. He looked at a grimy maintenance hatch labeled 7CP4. He shrugged, tapped an all-clear icon on his data pad, and turned away. The vision was gone as quickly as it came, leaving Jorin breathless. Panel 4, Jorin heard himself say, the words feeling alien on his tongue. The hinge on the access cover is corroded. They bypass the physical check, just sign it off on the data pad every third shift. Grendel's eyes, small and bright in his fleshy face, lit up with avaricious glee. He grinned, showing teeth stained by cheap Sump-Rat. There we are, deep and safe. See? A tool welder. Just a tool.
Jorin felt a wave of nausea. He hadn't remembered that. He had lived it. He had been Kovac for a second, felt the man's lazy indifference, his desire to just end the shift. He had stolen a moment from a stranger's life. Just as Grendel turned back to the schematic, a new sensation sliced through Jorin. It wasn't a whisper. It was a scream, silent and cold, exploding behind his eyes. The ozone smell of the hideout was gone, replaced by the overpowering metallic tang of blood in freezing salt water. Crack! The sound of imploding metal, the shriek of a child. Not his child, another child. He saw a small face, framed by dark hair, pressed against the thick plexiglass of a HAB unit window. The world outside the window wasn't the sump. It was black water, filled with a blizzard of debris. The girl's eyes were wide with a terror so absolute it was crystalline. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out. The plexiglass began to craze, a spiderweb of fractures spreading from the center. Jorin gasped, stumbling back from the stool. He clutched his head, his knuckles white. The hideout slammed back into focus, the orange light searing his eyes. He was panting, a cold sweat breaking out on his neck. The memory, a sliver of someone else's final horrific moment, left an echo of ice in his veins. Grendel looked over, his smile gone, replaced by irritation. Rust-Rot lighter, hold it together. What is it, another ghost story? The window, Jorin rasped, unable to stop the words. It's breaking. What window? Grendel snapped. There are no windows here. Get a grip on yourself. You're no good to me if you're a babbling Sump-Rat. He saw the fear in Jorin's eyes, not of him, but of something inside. Grendel's expression softened, but only fractionally. It was the look of a man assessing a valuable but faulty piece of equipment. He walked over to a heavy-duty storage locker and unlatched the door. Look, he said, his voice dropping, this isn't for free. You aren't just buying sanctuary. He pulled out a single, clear canister of water. It was free of the chemical tint of recycled tap water. Condensation beaded on its cold surface. Next to it, he placed a pack of nutrient bars, not the gray paste, but amber-colored algae-based solids that mimicked the texture of pre-inundation food. Finally, a small vial of real sun vitamin D supplement.
This is what you're earning, Grendel said, nudging the canister toward Jorin. A full belly, water that doesn't taste of rust and regret. A body that doesn't ache from deficiency. Survival. That's the deal. You use the voices in your head to fill my storerooms, and I use my storerooms to keep you alive and out of a compliance med bay. Jorin stared at the canister of water. He could almost feel its clean coolness on his parched throat. He thought of the brackish, recycled water dripping from his own hab unit. He thought of the gnawing emptiness in his stomach. He thought of the shrieking, cold death of the girl behind the glass. One was the price, the other was the reward. He reached out, his hand trembling, and took the canister. The cold plastic was a shock of reality against his skin. The deal was made. He had sold a piece of his sanity, of someone else's dying memory, for a drink of clean water. "It's not a tool," Jorin whispered, so low Grendel almost didn't hear him. The title lord just shrugged. "Everything is a tool, Welder, if you know how to hold it." The spire's silence was a weapon. It was a dense, manufactured quiet, woven from sound-dampening composites and the sheer tonnage of water pressing down from the twilight zone. In her command center, Praxilavar cultivated this silence, sharpened it. It was the perfect environment for a diagnosis. Before her, suspended in the sterile, ozone-tinged air, floated Amphitrite, not the city, but the data ghost of it, a shimmering holographic lattice of struts, conduits, and pressure-hauled habitats descending into darkness. And within it, a sickness. Her gaze was fixed on the lower levels, the sump. A cancerous bloom of crimson data pulsed there, a slow biological tide creeping through the city's digital veins. It was a beautiful and repulsive thing, this visual representation of the choral echo. Each pulse was a new infection logged, another mind touched by the abyss. The bloom's epicenter was a single, furiously blinking point of light, labeled Jorin, K. Welder, Deep Maintenance. A low, resonant groan shuddered through the obsidian floor, a deep-frequency tremor that the spire's engineering could dampen, but not erase. It was the sound of the hull, the sound of a patient in chronic pain. Praxilla's jaw tightened. The city was speaking to her, and she was listening. Chief Ar—
The voice was a disruption, a tiny pocket of turbulence in the controlled atmosphere. She didn't turn. Her eyes remained on the pulsing red. Junior Officer Kalin stood a respectful 5 paces back, his posture a study in rigid apprehension. He was Spire-born. He smelled of nutrient paste that had faint synthesized flavorings, and his compliance uniform was still stiff with its first-issue press. He had never known the metallic tang of real fear. "What is it, officer?" she asked, her voice as flat and polished as the floor. The projections are updated, ma'am, from sustenance." He gestured to a secondary screen on his datapad. "Based on the fugitive welder's movements and the water reclamation cycle, if we initiate a hard quarantine of the sump, the models predict a 94% fatality rate within 3 cycles. Starvation, dehydration, asphyxiation." He fell silent. The words hung in the air, thick and clumsy. Fatality rate, a clinical term for thousands of screaming deaths in a black, sealed box. Praxilla had read the same report an hour ago. The numbers were irrelevant. The percentage was the only thing that mattered. It was not 100. "And the cross-contamination probability if we do not initiate quarantine?" Praxilla asked, finally turning her head just enough to catch his reflection in a brushed steel console. Kalin flinched as if caught. 78% citywide infection within 5 cycles, ma'am. Catastrophic. Hull integrity failure becomes an inevitability." "An inevitability," she repeated, the words tasting like iron filings. She turned fully to face him now. The spire's simulated daylight glinted off the silver insignia on her collar, casting his young, earnest face in stark relief. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the pathetic flicker of conscience. "With respect, Chief," Kalen pressed, his voice dropping slightly, "there are over 50,000 souls in the sump, families, workers who keep the turbines spinning. We'd be sealing them in a tomb. Is there no other way? A targeted action?" Priscilla took a slow, deliberate step toward him. He instinctively took a step back. "Souls, Officer Kalen. A sentimental word. Let me offer you a more useful one. Tissues."
She gestured with a sweep of her arm at the glowing hologram. "That is not a city. It is a body. The spire is its cerebral cortex, the turbines, its heart, the filtration systems, its lungs, and the sump," her finger extended, pointing to the festering crimson bloom. "The sump is a limb afflicted with wet gangrene." Her gaze was unflinching. She felt the internal shift, the clinical contemplation of the problem solidifying into the cold, hard mass of a solution. The nagging groan of the hall seemed to fade, replaced by the clarity of her own purpose. "You speak of families, I see cell clusters. You speak of workers, I see compromised biological agents. This welder, Jorin, he is not a hero who saved a few lives by plugging a pipe. He is patient zero, a pathogen given legs. Every person he contacts, every liter of water he contaminates, he is spreading the necrosis. The whispers they hear in the gills, the flicker of strange memories, those are the symptoms of a terminal disease, both for the individual and for the whole." She began to pace slowly, her heels clicking with the finality of a closing airlock. "Tell me, officer, when a surgeon finds a malignant tumor, does he weep for the individual cells he must excise? Does he mourn the amputation that saves the patient's life? No. He cuts. He cuts cleanly, and he cuts deeply to ensure the sickness does not spread to the vital organs. He does not hesitate because the tissue is screaming. All dying tissue screams." Kalen's face had gone pale. The synthetic aromas of his privileged life seemed to have evaporated, replaced by the sharp electric scent of his own fear. "But it's a choice, a moral calculus." "It is the only calculus," Praxilla countered, her voice dropping to an intense, almost intimate level. She stopped directly in front of him. "The founders of this city understood it. They faced the same blight a generation ago, and they chose to hide it, to cut out the data instead of the source. Their sentimentality is why we are here now, listening to the very bones of our world groan in agony. They chose to spare the limb, and now the entire body is septic." She held his gaze, seeing not a subordinate, but a symbol of the weakness she was born to fight. The belief that a single life, or 50,000, could matter more than the whole. It was a rust-rot of the mind, a philosophical breach more dangerous than any fissure in the hull. "The hull is the whole, officer. That is not a motto for ration queues. It is the first and last law of our survival. The sump is already dead. It just hasn't stopped twitching yet. Our duty is not to mourn it. Our duty is to contain the decay before it poisons us all." Her conviction was now absolute, a perfect, crystalline structure in her mind. There was no more debate. There was only the procedure. The icy certainty was a comfort, a shield against the horror of the act itself. Kalen said nothing. He simply stared, his youthful idealism shattering against her logic like glass against steel. He gave a short,
jerky nod. "Good," Prexilla said, turning her back on him and returning to the command console. She dismissed him from her mind as efficiently as a surgeon discards a bloodied swab. Her fingers danced across the holographic interface. The crimson bloom of the sump pulsed, ignorant and alive. She brought up a new command schematic, a network of blue lines overlaying the district's perimeter. Massive, thick lines that corresponded to the primary quarantine bulkheads. The command was labeled Hull Integrity ACT, Section 7, Total Bio-Isolation. Kaelin was still standing there, a ghost in her periphery. She didn't care. "A surgeon doesn't mourn," she whispered to herself, her voice a sterile hiss. "He cures." With a single, unhesitating tap of her index finger, she authorized the protocol. On the holographic map, the blue lines began to glow with a steady, fierce light. The first step of the amputation had been taken. The patient would be saved, whatever the cost. The sanctuary was a lung, a single, dark, breathing space carved from the city's forgotten anatomy. Here, in a disused cistern deep in the sump's undercroft, the constant groan of Amphitrite's hull was a distant, sleeping beast. The only immediate sounds were the slow, rhythmic plink of a water droplet falling from a rust-furred pipe into a central pool, and the soft, collective sigh of human breath. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something clean and alive, the faint ozonic perfume of the glimmer moss that coated the curved walls. It pulsed with a gentle green-gold light, casting a living glow that was the antithesis of the sump's sickly orange sodium lamps and cold blue neons.
Hestian sat at the center of the small gathering. His legs were crossed, his back straight, his posture a quiet defiance against the crushing weight of the 5 vertical kilometers of ocean above. His left eye, a normal, gentle brown, was closed. His right eye, however, was open and aware, an orb of impossible bioluminescent green that seemed to drink in the moss light and reflect it back, intensified. It was the eye that saw more than the cistern. It saw the currents of memory that flowed through the 3 people sitting with him. They were the echo-touched, a ship's cook whose hands now trembled with the phantom chill of a drowning he'd never experienced, a young hydroponics tech who sometimes spoke with the voice of a first-generation engineer, a quiet elderly man who simply stared into the rippling pool, his mind lost in the final terrifying moments of a dozen strangers. "Do not fight the tide," Hestian's voice was a low melodic hum, perfectly pitched to ride above the dripping water without disturbing it. "You are not the water. You are the stone at the bottom of the sea." He felt their fear as a dissonant chord in the quiet symphony of the echo. The cook was struggling, his mind a knot of terror. He was trying to build a dam against the flood of memories, and the pressure was threatening to shatter him. "Cormac," Hestian said, his voice soft but firm, "unclench your fists. Feel the deck plates beneath your feet. Now feel the memory. A welder, wasn't it? On the outer hull. He was not afraid. He was proud. He loved the dance in the dark. Let his pride flow through you. Let his calm be your calm." Internally, Hestian did more than speak.
He reached out with his own more practiced consciousness, a shepherd guiding his flock. He found the jagged, panicked memory that was savaging Cormac and gently wrapped it in another, the welder's quiet satisfaction, softening its edges, transforming the terror of a suit breach into a moment of final, star-bright release. He felt Cormac's psychic tension ease, the man's shoulders slumping in relief. It was exhausting work, filtering the static, finding the signal in the noise.
This was his purpose, not to silence the echo and act as futile as trying to command the ocean to be still, but to teach others how to listen, to show them that the voices were not a madness, but an archive, a library of lives that had touched the deep. A sudden violent clang of metal on metal from the entrance tunnel shattered the fragile peace. It was a jarring, ugly sound, the voice of the Sump intruding on their sanctum. The three followers flinched as one, their shared tranquility instantly curdled into alarm. Seconds later, a figure stumbled into the green-gold light, collapsing against the slick wall of the cistern. It was a young woman, Kaelin, her face pale and streaked with grime, her chest heaving. Her eyes were wide with a terror that was entirely her own.
"They were there, Hestian,"
she gasped, her words tumbling over each other.
"At the nutrient block, the gray suits, compliance, just standing there. Not the regular patrols, these were different, quiet, watching."
The elderly man began to tremble. The hydroponics tech hugged her knees to her chest, her knuckles white. The discordant hum of their fear buzzed in Hestian's mind, a swarm of angry hornets. Kaelin pushed herself upright, her breath catching in a sob. "They had one of the scanners, the little ones. They were asking about the pipe burst, about the welder. They looked right at me, and I ran." Hestian rose in a single fluid motion. He moved to her, his bare feet making no sound on the damp floor. His glowing eye was a beacon of calm in the swirling panic. "Breathe, Kaelin," he murmured, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You are here now. The sound of the sump cannot reach you here. Deep and safe." As his fingers made contact, he felt it. The memory flash she carried sharp as a shard of pressure glass. The cold analytical gaze of a plainclothes compliance officer. The metallic glint of the bioscanner. The officer's lips moving, forming a name. Jorin. And beneath it, a deeper, older echo. Kaelin's own mind had dredged up. The memory of another arrest, another time, ending in a sterile white room and a needle. Hestian absorbed the spike of her terror, drawing it into himself. It was a bitter, chemical taste in his consciousness. He felt his own jaw tighten for a fraction of a second before he forced it to relax. "They did not follow you," he said, stating it as a fact, a certainty to anchor her. He guided her toward the center of the room, to the space she had vacated. "Sit. Drink." He picked up a tin cup of the clean, unfiltered water, a treasure in the lower levels, and pressed it into her trembling hands. He turned to the others, his gaze sweeping over them, his glowing eye a steady lamp. "Fear is the only sickness. It is what Praxilavar and the Council use to keep the spire clean and the sump compliant. They tell you that you are broken, that this connection," he tapped the side of his glowing eye, "is a disease, a rust-rot of the mind." He let the silence hang for a moment, punctuated by the single, steady drip of water. "We know better. This is not a breaking,
It is a joining. We are the memory of the deep, and they are afraid because they have forgotten how to listen. His words were a balm. He could feel the panic in the room receding, the hornet swarm of fear dispersing, replaced by a sullen, watchful quiet. Kaelin drank the water in shuddering sips, her eyes fixed on him, wanting to believe. But the sanctuary's perfect peace was gone. The clang of the sump echoed in their minds. The word compliance hung in the air like ozone. Hestian turned away from them, his back to his flock, as he stared into the dark, dripping maw of the entrance tunnel. His serene expression was a mask for their benefit. Inside, his mind was a turbulent sea. The welder, Jorin, his flight had done more than just save himself. It had shaken the foundations of the city's fragile order. Praxilla was not just investigating a contamination anymore. She was hunting a fugitive. She was hunting a symbol. And the hunt was leading her here, to the deep, dark places where the echo-touched gathered. His little island of peace, this quiet lung in a dying city, was now on her map. He could feel the net tightening, the patrols above multiplying like spiders spinning a web. Time, he realized with a cold certainty that had nothing to do with the echo, was running out. The calm he projected was a lie he was telling not just to them, but to himself. His glowing green eye seemed to pulse, its light dimming for a moment as if clouded by his worry. He took a deep breath, the damp, earthy air doing little to settle the disquiet in his soul. Then he turned back, the mask of the serene shepherd perfectly in place once more.
"Rest," he said, his voice once again a calm, steady anchor. "We are deep, we are safe." He paused, and the lie caught in his throat, forcing a final, grimly honest addendum. For now. The Sump Central Market was a river of noise and desperation flowing through a canyon of rust-streaked cargo containers. It smelled of ozone, frying protein paste, and the damp, metallic tang of unwashed humanity packed too close together. Jorin kept his eyes fixed on the broad, worn back of Grendel Brekker's coat, a slab of dark fabric moving through the throng like an icebreaker through sludge. The Tide Lord navigated the chaos with an innate, brutal economy of motion, his shoulders clearing a path that Jorin scurried to fill before it closed behind him. Every flicker of the overhead sodium lamps, every hiss of steam from a noodle vendor's cart, every shouted bargain felt like a physical blow. The cacophony of 1,000 simultaneous conversations was a grinding pressure against his skull, a perfect medium for the whispers of the choral echo to breed. He could feel them at the edge of his hearing, the ghosts of drowned words, trying to find purchase in the din. "Keep your head down and your mouth shut," Grendel had growled as they'd entered the market. "We're just two hole-clingers looking for a replacement water chip. Look like you belong." Jorin tried. He hunched his shoulders, pulled the collar of his jacket tighter, and focused on the rhythmic squeak of his worn boot heels on the grated floor. He belonged here. This was his world. The noise, the grime, the constant low-frequency thrum of the geothermal turbines vibrating up through the soles of his feet. It was the lullaby he'd lived with his entire life. But since his escape into the Whispering Gills, since his pact with Grendel, it had all become alien, hostile. They passed a stall cobbled together from scavenged sheet metal, its counter displaying a pathetic array of pre-inundation junk,
tarnished silver utensils, data drives wiped clean by magnetic decay, cracked ceramics. Behind the counter, an old man with a face like a road map of grief polished a small dented music box with a frayed rag. Jorin's gaze snagged on the man's hands, the knuckles swollen, the skin paper-thin over the bone. And then it happened.
It wasn't a thought. It was a pressure change in his mind, a cold, abyssal tide rising up to drown the present. The market's roar faded, replaced by a sudden, sterile quiet. The sickly orange glow of the work lamps overhead bled into the clean, full-spectrum light of a spire-level hab. A phantom sensation, the ghost of a memory that wasn't his, superimposed itself over his reality. He was no longer Jorin, walking through the market. He was the old man, standing behind the stall, but years earlier. The air was cleaner. His back didn't ache. His hand, my hand, was clenched in his pocket, knuckles white. The feeling was not his own, but it was perfectly legible, a frantic, desperate searching. Patting his pockets, his tunic, his trousers. The panic rose, hot and sharp, a needle of ice in his chest. Where is it? Rust-rot, where is it? The voice was a thought, not a sound, but it was the old man's, full of a gravelly terror Jorin had never known, and yet understood completely. He felt the man's memory of running through a pristine corridor, the smooth, brushed steel walls a blur. He'd been knocked, jostled by a compliance officer in a hurry. He hadn't thought anything of it. But now the locket was gone. Jorin's own feet were frozen to the market floor, but in his mind he felt the old man's knees weaken. He saw through the man's eyes the object of his terror, a small silver locket, oval-shaped, with a tiny, intricate engraving of a seabird on the front. It wasn't the locket itself. It was the face inside. A woman with a kind smile and eyes the color of the old sky. A sky he'd only ever seen on corrupted data drives. His wife, gone for 20 years, but always there in the locket. A wave of absolute soul-crushing grief washed over Jorin. It was not his grief. It was not the familiar hollowed-out cavern of his daughter's absence. This was a foreign sorrow, sharp and new and agonizing, and the choral echo jammed it into Jorin's soul like a shattered piece of glass. For a horrifying second, the woman's face in the locket flickered, and he saw his own daughter, Ilara, her hair floating in the dark water, her eyes wide with surprise. The two sorrows merged, the old man's loss and his own. They became one unbearable, monstrous thing.
A sound tore from Jorin's throat, a choked, wounded gasp. He staggered back, his hand flying to his own chest, right where the phantom locket should have been. The world of the market rushed back in, a sensory tidal wave. The river of people had stopped flowing. An eddy of silence and concerned, suspicious faces formed around him. "Rust-rot," a voice snarled in his ear. A hand like a pressure clamp seized his bicep. Grendel. The Tide Lord's face was a thundercloud of pure fury. He didn't ask if Jorin was okay. He didn't offer a hand. He acted. "Move," he spat and yanked. Jorin stumbled, his legs like jelly. Grendel was a force of nature, shoving a startled-looking woman out of their way and pulling Jorin after him. The crowd parted, more from the raw menace radiating from Grendel than his physical force. "Just a bit of bad paste," Grendel barked at no one in particular. "He'll walk it off." They plunged into a narrow gap between two cargo containers, a slice of darkness reeking of mildew and leaking sanitation fluid. The roar of the market was instantly cut to a dull murmur. Here, there was only the rhythmic plink-plunk of dripping water and the ghostly green-gold glow of phosphorescent fungi clinging to the corrugated metal walls. Grendel slammed him against the slick, cold surface. The impact rattled Jorin's teeth and drove the air from his lungs. He slid down the wall, his head spinning, the aftershock of the borrowed grief still trembling through him. What in the drowned hells was that? Grendel loomed over him, his face inches from Jorin's, silhouetted against the market's distant light. Jorin could only shake his head, pressing the heels of his hands into his eyes. I felt... He couldn't explain it. How could he explain that he was mourning a woman he'd never met, for a man he didn't know? Grendel grabbed his jaw, his calloused fingers digging into Jorin's skin, forcing his head up. Grendel's eyes were like chips of obsidian. I don't care what you saw, I don't care what you felt. You are a tool, Jorin, a key. That thing in your head is showing you weaknesses. A memory of a pickpocket tells you where the compliance patrols are lazy. A memory of a faulty pipe shows you a way out. You don't get to drown in it.
He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, menacing whisper. You bleed these memories all over the market, and you don't just expose yourself, you expose me. You ever freeze like that again, you're not just a liability, you're bait. Do you understand me? He let go with a contemptuous shove. Jorin's head lolled back against the wet metal. The foreign grief was finally receding like a fever breaking, leaving behind only the cold, familiar ache of his own emptiness. He looked at Grendel, at the utter lack of sympathy in the tidal lord's face, and understood with perfect, terrifying clarity. He wasn't an ally, he wasn't a person, he was a volatile asset, a ghost that bled other ghosts. And in the suffocating depths of Amphitrite, he was completely and utterly alone. The sump breathed its usual labored breath. In the mid-level market, Kalen stirred a vat of steaming gray protein paste. The scent, a mix of bland chemosynthesis and ozone from a sputtering junction box overhead, was the smell of his entire life. Above the low murmur of ration-weary voices and the hiss of his own steam manifold, the city's heart kept its eternal grinding rhythm, the deep-frequency thrum of the geothermal turbines, a sound so constant it was the same as silence. He ladled a scoop of paste into a polymer bowl for a weary-eyed hydrofarmer, their jewel chit slick with condensation. Deep and safe, they muttered to each other, the greeting a prayer against the groaning metal that was their world. A drip of rust-colored water fell from a sweating pipe and sizzled on his heating element. Normal. Another drip fell beside it. Normal. The hum of the crowd, the shuffle of boots on grated metal flooring, the distant clang of a dropped tool. All normal. Then came the sound that was not. It began with a pop, sharp and electric, from the junction box above. The sickly orange sodium vapor lamps over the market flickered once, twice, and died. For a single suspended heartbeat, the only light came from the cold blue neon of the Sump sustenance sign and the ghostly green-gold glow of phosphorescent fungi clinging to the bulkheads. In that breath of darkness, the constant thrum of the turbines seemed to fall away, leaving a vacuum of absolute, terrifying quiet. Then the klaxon hit. It wasn't the sharp, intermittent pulse of a hull breach alarm, the sound that haunted every sump dweller's nightmares. This was different. A solid, single, deafening tone that didn't shriek but blared, a wall of sound so immense it felt physical, pressing in from all sides. It vibrated through the deck plating, up Kalen's legs, rattling the teeth in his skull. Every conversation stopped. Every head snapped up. Bowls of paste were dropped, their contents splattering across the grimy floor.
Across the market, Lyra snatched her hand back from the scrap dealer's stall. The dealer, a Tidal Lord affiliate, with a salvaged optical implant that glowed a faint red, didn't even notice. His gaze was fixed on the ceiling. Lyra's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic counter-rhythm to the klaxon. Her son, Finn, who had been tracing patterns in the slick biofilm on a support pillar, froze. His small face, pale in the blue neon glow, turned to her, eyes wide with the question she had no answer for. She didn't hesitate. She lunged, scooping him into her arms. His small body was rigid with fear. "Mama?" he whispered, his voice lost in the crushing noise. Then the lights came back, but they weren't the familiar orange. Strobing emergency crimson flooded the market, painting everything in visceral shades of blood and shadow. The panicked murmur of the crowd began to swell, a wave cresting towards a scream. And through the klaxon, a new sound emerged, a voice. It came from every voxcaster in the sump, perfectly calm, perfectly dispassionate, perfectly human, robotic. "Attention, all residents of the Sump District." Short pause. "By order of the Tri-Arc Council Compliance Division, the Hull Integrity Act, Section Gamma, is now in effect." Short pause. "This is not a drill." On a maintenance catwalk 40 feet above the chaos, Rorik and his crewmate stared down at the scene. They had been arguing about the welder, Jorin. "Like the pipe just told him where to cut," Rorik had been saying. The klaxon had cut him off mid-sentence. Now, bathed in the pulsing red light, they watched the market floor transform. What had been an orderly, if grim, collection of people was becoming a panicked mob. "Rust rot," Rorik's friend breathed, his knuckles white where he gripped the safety rail. "What's Section Gamma?" Rorik shook his head, a cold dread seeping into his bones. "I don't know. Something old. Something they don't talk about." The automated voice continued, its serene, measured tone a grotesque counterpoint to the rising tide of fear below. "All residential hab blocks, markets, and workshop sectors within the Sump are now under indefinite quarantine. Movement between sectors is terminated." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Quarantine. The word was a death sentence. It meant sickness. It meant being cut off. It meant the Spire had decided the Sump was a gangrenous limb to be amputated. "No!" a woman near Kalen's stall screamed, the first distinct voice to break through the noise. "My shift! I have to get to the middeck!" Her cry broke the dam. Panic erupted. People began to run, shoving, shouting. The human tide Lyra had feared was now a reality. She hugged Finn tighter, his face buried in her neck, and tried to push against the flow towards the perceived safety of a sealed bulkhead. Someone slammed into her, spinning her around. She stumbled, her boots slipping on spilled protein paste. "Finn, hold on!" she cried, her voice raw. The klaxon finally ceased, but the silence it left behind was worse. It was filled by the sound of 1,000 panicked breaths, the slap of running feet, and the first terrified screams. And a new noise, a low, monstrous grinding. It was the sound of metal on a scale that dwarfed everything else. The sound of a tomb being sealed. "All primary and secondary pressure bulkheads are now closing. Secure your position immediately. Do not attempt to obstruct the doors. Compliance is absolute."
Rorik watched from the catwalk as, at the far end of the market square, a sheet of colossal, rust-pitted metal began to descend from a hidden recess in the ceiling. It was 20 feet thick, a slab of the city's own bone, groaning under its own impossible weight. Sparks showered down as it scraped against its housing. The crowd near it surged back, trampling those who fell. The grinding was joined by others from every direction, a chorus of finality. Lyra saw it too. The doorway she was fighting towards, the one leading to the sector where her small hab unit was being eaten by a descending wall of steel. "No! Please!" People threw themselves at the narrowing gap, only to be crushed or forced back by the sheer, indifferent force of the mechanism. She was too far, trapped.
Kalen stood frozen behind his stall, the overturned vat of paste pooling at his feet. He watched the red lights flash across the faces of his neighbors, faces contorted in pure, primal terror. These were the people he saw every day, the faces of the Sump. Now they were rats in a cage, and the cage was shrinking. The grinding intensified, a final, deafening shriek of stressed metal. Then a series of earth-shaking clangs that echoed through the district, one after another like the closing of a series of giant locks. And then silence. A heavy, profound silence, broken only by the sobbing of those left behind and the relentless strobing pulse of the red emergency lights. The air, thick and suddenly very cold, tasted of iron and fear. The deep thrum of the city was gone, severed. They were adrift. From the catwalk, Rorik looked at his friend. The entire Sump, from the deepest foundation pits to the upper filtration gills, was now a sealed box. The Hull Integrity Act. It wasn't about protecting the hull from the outside. It was about protecting the rest of Amphitrite from them. The automated voice spoke one last time, its tone unchanged, as if commenting on the weather. "Containment established. Remain calm. The hull is the whole." But the hull was no longer the whole. It was two halves, the living city and the tomb, and they were inside the tomb. The Sump Transit Hub was a concrete lung, perpetually inhaling and exhaling a tide of hull clingers. Bodies pressed close, a moving tapestry of damp synth weaves and weary faces under the cold, flickering stare of neon advertisements for nutrient paste. The air, thick with the tang of ozone and recycled water, was a familiar assault. Jorin kept his head down, letting Grendel Brekker shoulder a path through the throng. "The key isn't the hardware," Grendel was saying, his voice a low rumble that cut through the ambient din. "It's the access codes. The Spireborn change them weekly, but the old maintenance protocols, they never purged the back doors. Too much work. They're lazy, Jorin, complacent."
Jorin nodded, though he wasn't really listening. The cacophony of the hub was a blessing, a physical wall of sound that almost drowned out the whispers. Almost. They were still there, a faint undercurrent of panic and confusion from 100 drowned minds, a static hum beneath the city's groan. He felt a phantom chill, the memory of cold water that wasn't his own, and pulled the collar of his jacket tighter. A sudden, piercing tone cut through everything. It wasn't the shrill, cyclical alarm for a pressure breach or a fire drill. This was a single, sustained, brutal note that vibrated in the teeth. All motion in the hub ceased. Heads turned, searching for the source. The neon ads for Algae Crisp and Synth Protein Plus flickered once,
then died, plunging the hub into the stark, functional glare of orange sodium vapor work lamps. Then came the sound. It wasn't a shriek of stressed metal, the sound Jorin knew like his own heartbeat. This was deeper, a groan that spoke of ancient, planetary forces being brought to bear. A low, grinding roar that seemed to come from the very bones of Amphitrite. The floor beneath their feet began to tremble, a steady, terrifying vibration that sent ripples through the standing puddles of condensation. Panic, a spark in a dry forest, ignited. A single scream was followed by a dozen more, and the frozen crowd shattered into a stampede. Jorin was slammed sideways, his shoulder hitting a rusted bulkhead. He looked up, his welder's eyes instinctively tracing the source of the vibration to the ceiling 50 feet above, and he saw it. A section of the ceiling, 100 meters wide, was descending. It wasn't a panel, it was a wall. A colossal slab of reinforced steel, 10 meters thick, edged with a brutalist geometry of interlocking teeth. A sector quarantine bulkhead. He'd only ever seen them on schematics. Monolithic relics of the arcology's initial construction, designed for a catastrophe no one believed would ever come. Dust, rust, and the desiccated husks of phosphorescent fungi rained down as the gate ground its way downward, its movement unnervingly smooth, unstoppably powerful. "Rust rot!" Grendel's voice was a raw shout next to his ear. The Tidal Lord's face was pale, his eyes wide with a terror that was purely pragmatic. He grabbed Jorin's arm, his grip like a pressure clamp. "They're sealing it! They're sealing the whole sump!"
Jorin's mind went blank. The whispers of the echo vanished, erased by the sheer, overwhelming reality of the descending metal. The crowd was a single, screaming organism, a torrent of bodies flowing away from the descending bulkhead towards the one remaining exit, the transit line that led up level towards the spire. "Move!" Grendel roared, yanking him into the current. "Now! We have to get through!" They were running, but it was like running through setting concrete. The mob had no direction, only fear. People fell, their screams abruptly cut off as they were trampled underfoot. Jorin stumbled, his boot catching on a discarded pack. Grendel hauled him upright without slowing. The air was filled with the stench of sweat and pure animal fear. A woman with a compliance tattoo on her neck shoved past them, her face a mask of disbelief. Even the wolves were being caged with the sheep. The grinding of the bulkhead was deafening. Jorin risked a glance back. It had already covered a third of the distance, its descent casting a creeping, absolute shadow across the hub. The orange work lamps glinted off its pitted dark surface. It was a jaw closing on them, not with malice, but with the cold, indifferent physics of a machine following its final command. Inside his head a memory flared, not his own. A flicker of vision, the cramped metal confines of a torpedo tube, the clank of an outer door locking, the sudden violent surge of pressurized water. A man's mind, a submariner from the old world, screaming in silent, suffocating blackness as he was fired into the abyss. Jorin cried out, the phantom pressure crushing his own lungs. He staggered, his legs threatening to give out. "Jorin, stay with me!" Grendel's shout was a lifeline. He pulled Jorin behind a massive cylindrical support pillar as a wave of panicked runners slammed into them. The steel of the pillar was cold and vibrated violently against Jorin's back. They were only halfway across the hub. The spire side exit was still 100 meters away, a rectangle of pale blue light that was shrinking with every passing second. People were clawing at each other to get through, a frantic, desperate scrum at the mouth of the tunnel.
The bulkhead was now less than 20 feet from the floor. Its shadow had swallowed almost the entire transit hub. The grinding sound intensified, accompanied by the high-pitched shriek of displaced air. Grendel had stopped pulling. He stood, his hand still clamped on Jorin's arm, and simply watched. The fight was over. He knew it. They saw a maintenance worker in a yellow jumpsuit make a final, desperate dive for the closing gap. He was almost through, half his body on the other side, but he was too slow. The bottom edge of the bulkhead, a meter-thick plate of solid steel, met the reinforced plasteel of the floor. There was no scream, just a soft, final thump, a sound absorbed by the cataclysmic impact that followed. The world ended in a single sound, a boom that was not heard but felt, a concussion that traveled up through the soles of their boots, through their bones and into the core of their being. The entire hub shook, and a secondary rain of dust and ceiling panels cascaded down. The lights went out completely for a full 3 seconds, plunging them into absolute, terrifying blackness. Then emergency power kicked in. Red strobes began to pulse, casting the scene in a gory, rhythmic light. The hub, moments ago a chaos of motion, was now a frozen tableau of despair. The stampede had ceased. People stood, staring at the wall that had just materialized, their faces slack with shock. The silence that followed the impact was more terrifying than the noise. The city's constant deep-frequency thrum was gone. The drip of condensation, the hum of turbines, all of it was gone. The only sound was the scattered, ragged weeping of the damned. Grendel let go of Jorin's arm and slammed his fist against the support pillar, the metallic clang echoing unnaturally in the dead air. "Rust rot," he breathed, the word devoid of its usual anger, filled only with a chilling finality. Praxilla, that witch, she actually did it. Jorin stared at the seamless wall of dark steel. The spire-side exit was gone. The transit line was gone. The world he knew, the system he had served, had amputated him. He was no longer a citizen of Amphitrite. He was an inhabitant of the Sump, and the Sump was a tomb. He reached out a trembling hand, not to touch the wall, but feeling for something in the air. The pressure, it had changed. The oppressive weight of the ocean above felt closer, more intimate. And inside his mind the choral echo stirred. It was no longer a chorus of frantic whispers. It was a single, collective, listening intelligence. It had felt the cage close. And in the sudden, profound silence of the sealed district, its voice, for the first time, was the only thing Jorin could hear clearly. The air in the sanctuary tasted of wet stone, ozone, and the loamy sweetness of the glimmer moss that traced the curved walls in lattices of gold-green light. It was a pocket of impossible peace, carved from the decommissioned bowels of Amphitrite, a forgotten cistern where the city's constant grinding thrum was muted to a distant heartbeat. Hestian sat on a floor of packed earth, his legs crossed. The half-dozen souls gathered with him were quiet, their faces painted in the soft, living light. A young woman named Kyra was tracing the veins of a phosphorescent leaf, her brow furrowed in concentration. An old man, his skin a roadmap of sump life hardship, was simply breathing, his eyes closed. Peace. Not silence, for there was no such thing. There was the rhythmic drip of condensation from a high, unseen pipe, a sound like a patient clock. There was the gentle hum of the recirculator Hestian had jury-rigged to filter their air. These were the sounds of life, not decay. Hestian closed his human eye, the one that saw only surfaces. His left eye, the one the echo had claimed, remained open. Through it, the glimmer moss did not just glow, it breathed. The currents of air were visible as shimmering, slow-moving tides. He could feel the collective anxiety of the sump above them, a dissonant chord in the city's deep song. But down here he had cultivated a harmony, a fragile, precious thing. It began as a vibration in his bones, deeper than the usual groan of the hull. This was a new note, a bass growl that resonated up through the packed earth floor. The water in a nearby basin trembled, its surface turning to 1,000 concentric vibrating rings. The old man's eyes snapped open. "What is that?"
Kyra looked up, her face pale in the green glow. The growl was getting louder, a sound of immense geological friction. It was the sound of a god turning in its sleep. The glimmer moss flickered as if in a sudden wind. Dust, smelling of rust and ages, rained down from the domed ceiling. Then came the panic. "It's a breach!" someone shrieked, scrambling backward, their hands flying to their head. "The hull is going!" The low growl was joined by a high-frequency scream of tortured metal, a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the spine. The entire chamber began to shake, not a tremor, but a violent side-to-side shudder. Loose panels overhead chattered like teeth. Kyra cried out, curling into a ball. The others huddled together, a knot of terror in the center of the room. Their fear was a physical thing, a sour spike in the sanctuary's atmosphere that Hestian could taste. It was acrid, sharp, an infection of its own kind. He did not move. He let the violent shuddering pass through him, a current in the great ocean of being. He kept his organic eye closed, focusing everything through the echo's gift. To his followers, this was the sound of death, the end of their world. To him, it was a message. He felt the colossal strain miles away, the unimaginable pressure being brought to bear on a section of the Sump's outer ring. He felt the groaning of the megastructure, not as a machine failing, but as a muscle contracting, a colossal heart seizing. He rose, his movements fluid and unhurried amidst the chaos. The shaking intensified, threatening to throw him from his feet, but his balance was preternatural. He walked to the nearest wall, the curved surface vibrating so hard it was a blur. His followers watched him, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and hope. He was their anchor, their still point in this storm. He placed his palm flat against the trembling metal. He didn't push or brace. He simply rested his hand there, a gesture of listening. The vibration flowed into him, a cacophony of data. The high-pitched scream of metal reached an impossible, agonizing crescendo. The lights from the glimmer moss strobed wildly, plunging the room into frantic cycles of green gold and absolute black. And then it happened. A sound beyond sound, a final, definitive, apocalyptic Krathum! It was not a noise one heard, but a physical blow. A shock wave of pure force slammed through the chamber, extinguishing the glimmer moss completely and throwing Hestian's followers to the floor. For a single, eternal second, there was only the ringing in their ears and the absolute, crushing blackness. Then, nothing. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. The constant, life-affirming thrum of Amphitrite, the deep-frequency hum of the turbines, the rush of air through the main vents, the groans of a living city, was gone. All of it. Utterly gone. The only sound was the frantic, ragged breathing of the people in the dark, and the slow, steady drip, drip, drip from the pipe overhead. It was the silence of a corpse.
Slowly, like newborn stars, the glimmer moss began to rekindle, their bioluminescence returning in faint, tentative pulses. The soft green-gold light spread, revealing the scene of terror. Everyone was on the floor, weeping or frozen in shock. Only Hestian remained standing, his hand still on the now still wall. He turned to face them. His glowing eye was a beacon in the gloom. He felt their fear, their certainty that this was the end, that they were cut off, buried alive. He smiled, a gentle, serene expression. "Do not fight it," he said. His voice was a soft current in the dead air, washing over them. "Do not fear the quiet. You have spent your lives straining to hear yourselves over the groaning of the whole. Now the hull holds its breath for you." He walked toward them, his bare feet silent on the packed earth. He knelt before Kyra, who was trembling uncontrollably. "They have sealed the gates," she whimpered. "They've cut us off." "They have given us a gift," Hestian corrected, his tone even and calm. He reached out, but did not touch her. "They have given us stillness. This is a moment of transformation. The old city, the city of noise and rust and fear, is falling silent."
He looked around at the small, terrified flock. "Listen," he urged, his voice dropping further, becoming a hypnotic whisper. "Listen past your own hammering heart. Can you hear it? The silence isn't empty. It's full. The great voice was always there, beneath the grinding of the gears. The echo was always singing. But now the machines are quiet. Now we can truly begin to listen." His words, and the profound, unwavering calm from which they were delivered, began to work on them. The sobbing subsided, the frantic breathing slowed. They were still terrified, still trapped, but he was offering them a different way to perceive their cage. He was reframing their tomb as a temple. Kyra looked up at him, her tear-streaked face bathed in the light of his strange green eye. She closed her own. She listened. Hestian stood, turning his gaze toward the dark, dripping tunnel that served the sanctuary's entrance. The old man, the others, they were trying. They were seeking the new song in the suffocating silence. A fragile calm, thin as spun glass, began to settle. But Hestian felt something else, a new signal, a new mind, loud with terror and grief and confusion, stumbling through the darkness of the whispering gills toward them. A singular, powerful voice about to join the choir. He smiled again, this time to himself. The welder, he was coming. He was finally listening. Chaos had a sound. In the Sump transit hub, it was the sound of 1,000 panicked voices caught in a single metal throat. A human wave surged against the mag-locked gates to the mid-levels, a wall of flesh and desperation. The air, thick with the sharp tang of ozone from shorting conduits and the briny dampness of fear sweat, vibrated with a city-wide klaxon, a shrieking two-toned wail that drilled directly into the skull. Jorin was a stone in that river, buffeted and shoved. His shoulder was pinned against a cold, weeping support pillar, slick with phosphorescent algae, its ghostly green-gold light illuminating the frantic faces around him. Every shove, every panicked gasp resonated inside him, not as his own fear, but as a chorus. The choral echo, roused by the collective terror, sang its drowning hymn.
He felt the crush of water, the burn of lungs giving out, the icy grip of 100 different deaths flooding his nerves. "Let us through!" a woman screamed, her voice tearing. "My kids are up there!" "Rust rot! They're locking us in!" A man in a greasy Tide Lord jacket bellowed near Jorin's ear. It was Grendel Brekker, his face a mask of primal fury, his bulk a small island in the tide. Beside him, Hestian stood unnervingly still, the single biolume where his eye should be glowing with an unholy placidity. He seemed to be the only one not fighting the current. Jorin fought for breath, the pressure on his chest both real and imagined. He saw his daughter's face, Lena, in the screaming face of the woman for just a second. The memory wasn't his own. It was a fragment from the echo, but it hurt just the same. He pressed a hand to his temple, trying to force it out. Then a new sound cut through the pandemonium, a screech of tortured static from the hub's overhead speakers, followed by a voice. It was female, devoid of emotion, clipped and precise. Praxilla Var. "By order of the Triarch Council," the voice announced, each word a hammer blow, "and under the authority of the Hall Integrity Act, Sector Gamma 9, the Sump is now under full and immediate quarantine." A split second of stunned silence. The screaming woman stopped, mid-shriek. "This action is taken to ensure the biological security of Amphitrite. All transit is terminated. All resource lines are severed. Remain in your designated zones. The hull is the whole." The last phrase, their societal prayer, was twisted into a death sentence. Then came the groan. It wasn't the familiar complaint of a stressed arcology. This was deeper, older, a sound of finality. High above the mob, across the entire 100-meter span of the hub, a line of sickly orange emergency lights began to flash. Jorin's head snapped up. He knew that sequence. He had seen it in schematics 100 times. Primary pressure bulkhead activation. A seam in the ceiling, caked in decades of grime and rust, split open. With a hydraulic hiss that sounded like the world's last breath, a slab of metal began to descend. It was 20 meters thick, a solid mass of reinforced abyssal-grade alloy, designed to hold back the entire ocean if the sump was ever breached. Now it was being used to hold them in.
The descent was not fast, but it was inexorable. The grinding of colossal gears that had been silent since the city's founding filled the air, a sound so low and powerful it vibrated up through the soles of Jorin's boots, making his teeth ache. The crowd's frantic energy changed, the forward momentum ceased. People began to claw their way back, trampling those who fell. The push became a panicked scramble to retreat from the descending shadow. "No," a voice whispered beside Jorin. Ealdrick. He'd found Jorin in the chaos, his old face pale, his eyes wide with a horror that transcended fear. They wouldn't! But they were. The bottom edge of the bulkhead, stained dark with corrosion, cleared the upper gantries. It was a guillotine for 1,000 necks. A few desperate souls, caught near the threshold, made a final suicidal dash to scramble underneath. Jorin saw a young man in a welder's jumpsuit almost make it, his hand outstretched toward the narrowing gap of light. He was a heartbeat too slow. The metal slab didn't crush him. It simply erased him. Jorin felt the city through the echo. He felt the immense power being diverted, the shunting of geothermal energy to the hydraulic presses. He felt the magnetic locks on the other side of the wall engaging, their resonant frequencies a deep hum in his bones. This wasn't a temporary measure.
This was amputation. The slab kept coming. Down and down. Its shadow swallowed the last of the hub's main lighting. The space was plunged into a flickering twilight, lit only by the strobing orange emergency beacons and the ghostly green of the algae. The grinding intensified, a deafening metallic scream of protest from the very bones of amphitrite. The final 2 meters seemed to take an eternity. The air pressure changed, a sudden popping sensation in Jorin's ears as the massive volume of air was displaced. The klaxon was still blaring, the people were still screaming, but it was all being compressed, funneled into this final, closing moment. And then, impact.
It was not a sound. It was an event. A physical force that struck the deck plates with the weight of a mountain. A world-ending boom that was felt more than heard. A concussive wave that slammed through Jorin's body, knocking the air from his lungs and rattling his teeth. Dust and rust flakes rained down from the ceiling, a foul-smelling brown snow. The orange emergency strobes flickered once, twice, and died. The klaxons cut out. The screaming stopped. The echo of the impact reverberated for 3 long seconds, a fading, metallic thunder that rolled through the vast, dark space. Then, silence. It was an absolute, profound, and terrifying silence. A silence Jorin had never known in his entire life. The constant, deep-frequency thrum of the geothermal turbines was gone. The groan of stressed metal was gone. The hiss of ventilation, the drip of recycled water, the hum of technology, all of it gone. The city's heartbeat had stopped. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, no one moved, no one breathed. Jorin stood in near total darkness, the only light the faint, eerie glow from the fungus on the pillar beside him, casting long, dancing shadows. He could smell the ozone, the metallic dust, the raw animal scent of tightly packed, terrified bodies. He could hear the frantic thump of his own heart, and beneath it, the whispers of the echo, stunned into a murmur by the sudden, shocking quiet. They were entombed. The weight of the ocean above had always been a psychological pressure. Now it was a physical one. They were a bubble of air and life, trapped at the bottom of the world, and the rest of the world had just turned its back. The umbilical was cut. The silence was finally broken, not by a scream or a shout, but by a single, wretched sound that seemed to encapsulate all their despair. A sob. A man somewhere in the darkness began to weep, a raw, ragged sound of utter hopelessness. It was a tiny noise in the vast, dead chamber, yet it was louder than the chaos that had preceded it. Jorin felt a heavy hand clamp down on his shoulder. Grendel. He could feel the Tide Lord's body trembling, not with fear, but with a rage so profound it had become its own form of stillness. On his other side, Hestian's single green eye glowed brighter in the oppressive dark, a beacon of some alien calm in the heart of the tomb.
The distant, deep groan of a support beam, now bearing a load it was never meant to hold alone, echoed through the silence, a reminder that their grave was still settling. The sound of silence wasn't peace. It was the sound of the end beginning. The sound was absolute, not a noise, but the end of it. A concussion of metal on metal that vibrated through the floor plates, up the spine, and into the teeth. A final declarative groan of 1,000 tons of pressure-sealed durasteel slamming into its housing. A full stop. The groan was followed by a colossal, resonant clang that echoed through the Sump transit hub, once, twice, and then was swallowed by a sudden, impossible silence. For a moment that stretched into a lifetime, no one moved. The hub, usually a river of motion and noise, the shuffle of boots on graded walkways, the distant hum of maglifts, the echoing announcements of arrivals and departures, was frozen. The ever-present, deep-frequency thrum of the geothermal turbines, the bass note of life in Amphitrite, was gone. The silence it left behind was not peaceful. It was a vacuum, heavy and suffocating. It was the sound of a heart that had stopped beating. The main lights, powered by the now severed grid, died in a single, silent blink. Darkness, thick and abysmal, fell like a shroud. A collective gasp sucked the remaining air from the hub. A child started to cry, the sound thin and sharp in the oppressive quiet. Then another. Panic, a single spark in the dark, caught light. Then, a flicker. A stuttering, sickly orange glow sputtered from a sodium vapor lamp overhead. One by one, the emergency lights activated, casting long, monstrous shadows that danced and writhed across the cavernous space. The orange light painted everything in hues of rust and decay, reflecting off the perpetually damp walls and the terrified wide eyes of hundreds of trapped people. The smell of ozone, sharp and acrid from shorting conduits, stung the air.
But one man did not panic. Grendel Brekker stood on a raised cargo platform, his bulk silhouetted against an emergency lamp. He hadn't moved. He had felt the finality of the lockdown in his bones, not as a cage door swinging shut, but as a portcullis lowering on a new castle. His castle. He watched the chaos below him, the frantic, pointless scramble. He saw hull clingers clawing at the unmoving gate, their faces streaked with tears and grime. He saw a spire-borne functionary caught on the wrong side of the door, babbling incoherently, his pristine uniform already soiled. He saw fear, pure and uncut, a resource more valuable than jewel chits, more potent than glimmer moss. Rust-rot, Grendel thought. A slow, predatory smile touching his lips in the gloom. He didn't smile with his mouth, but with the gleam in his eyes. They weren't trapped. They were consolidated. All his customers, all his rivals, all his future assets gathered in one convenient location. Praxilla Var, in her infinite wisdom, had just handed him a kingdom. He took a deep breath, savoring the ozone-laced air. The fear was a symphony. His gaze swept over his crew, a dozen hard-faced men and women scattered around the hub. They were Tide Lords, scavengers, and enforcers hardened by the Sump's brutal realities. They looked to him now, their faces tense but waiting, their hands already drifting towards the salvaged rivet guns and pneumatic wrenches holstered at their hips. "Kale?" Grendel's voice was a low rumble, but it cut through the din. A wiry man with a face like a pitted bulkhead turned to him, his hand already on his weapon. "Status?" "Sealed tight, Grendel. Every major transit line. Sector 7, 8, 9, looks like the whole Sump. That was a full integrity lockdown." "Communications?" Kale tapped the cracked screen of his wrist puck. "Dead. No network. Not even a bleed-through from compliance channels. We're dark." Grendel almost laughed. Perfect. He raised his head, looking out over the sea of panicked faces. They were sheep without a shepherd, running in circles inside the abattoir. It was time to introduce them to the wolf. "Quiet!"
The word was a physical blow. It roared from his chest, amplified by the hub's acoustics, and for a breathtaking second it worked. The screaming subsided to whimpers. The frantic pushing eased. Hundreds of terrified eyes turned toward the large, imposing figure on the cargo platform. "Panicking won't unseal those doors," Grendel boomed, his voice dripping with condescending authority. He spread his hands, a gesture that was almost paternal, if not for the cruel amusement in his eyes. "Panicking won't get you water, it won't get you food. It will only get you trampled in the dark." He let that sink in. He saw the flicker of understanding, the dawning of a new, more specific terror. The doors weren't the only problem. "My people and I," he continued, gesturing to his crew, who now began to move with purpose, their weapons held low but visible, "are going to establish order. We are going to take inventory of supplies, of personnel. We are going to survive this, not as a mob, but as a unit." It was a lie, and every person there knew it. He wasn't offering salvation, he was declaring dominion. His crew fanned out, their movements crisp and practiced. Two of them, armed with heavy pneumatic hammers, strode toward the hub's dispensary, where the nutrient paste and emergency water rations were stored. The medic on duty took one look at them and backed away, hands raised. Another group began herding people away from the sealed gates, their methods efficient and brutal. A shove here, the flat of a hand there, no wasted energy. They were separating the crowd, creating clear lanes, controlling the space. Grendel turned to Kael, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Secure the dispensary first, then the water reclamation tap in the sublevel. Set up a perimeter. I want a count. Every soul. Healthy, sick, skilled, useless. I want to know exactly what I'm working with." Kael nodded, his eyes alight with the same predatory fire as his boss. "And the dissenters?" Grendel looked down at a man in a welder's jacket who was shouting, calling him a title lord thug, a parasite. He was trying to rally the people around him, appealing to their sense of community, to the Hull is the whole ideology that was now a dead creed.
Grendel simply pointed. "Make an example of him," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Don't kill him. Just make sure no one else feels brave enough to speak out of turn. This is my sump now." He watched as two of his crew descended on the man, the sickening crunch of a pneumatic wrench meeting bone barely audible over the renewed wave of frightened murmurs. Grendel stood tall, arms crossed over his massive chest, the undisputed king of a rust and steel prison. He looked out at the faces staring up at him, a mixture of terror and dawning, hopeless resignation. This wasn't a tomb. It was an incubator, a place where his power, unchecked and absolute, could finally grow. The klaxon died, but its ghost remained, a high-frequency shriek that vibrated in Jorin's teeth. Then came the sound that truly sealed their tomb, a deep, resonant boom that was more pressure wave than noise, a tectonic plate of hardened steel slamming into place miles away. The vibration traveled through the arcology skeleton, up through the grimy floor of the Sump transit hub, and into the marrow of his bones. It was a sound of absolute finality. The bulkhead was shut. For a single, drawn-out second, the hub fell into a stunned silence. The vast vaulted space, usually thrumming with the rhythmic clang of mag-trams and the chatter of shift changes, held its breath. Hundreds of people, welders in soot-stained coveralls, aquaculture techs reeking of brine and algae, off-duty maintenance crews stood frozen, their faces upturned towards the unseen barrier.
The sickly orange glow of the sodium vapor lamps cast long, distorted shadows, painting a tableau of disbelief. Jorin was just one body in the press, his shoulder jammed against a support pillar slick with condensation. The usual whispers of the choral echo were still there, faint and distant, like voices from a badly tuned radio. "Cold," a woman's voice sighed. "The pressure," a man rasped. His daughter's voice, the clearest of them all, was mercifully quiet. He braced himself, his heart hammering a frantic, offbeat rhythm against the city's deep-frequency thrum. He had to get out of the open, find a hole to crawl into, before... Then the silence broke. A single child started crying, a thin, piercing wail that sliced through the quiet. It was the starting pistol for a race to madness. A woman near the sealed mag tram tunnel screamed, a raw, ragged sound of pure terror. The crowd surged, a single organism convulsing. Shouts erupted. "Rustrot! What was that? Let us through! Compliance! Open the gate!" The air thickened, growing heavy not just with the scent of ozone and panicked sweat, but with something else. Something Jorin could feel on a level deeper than his senses. It was a pressure building behind his eyes, a static charge gathering in the air. The whispers in his head began to change. They were no longer the faded echoes of the long drowned. They were sharp, immediate, and alive. "My son is on the other side. My boy. I'm going to be late for my shift. They'll dock my jewels. I can't. Crushed! We're going to be crushed! The walls! Feel the walls!" Jorin squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the heels of his hands into his temples. It wasn't like before. This wasn't a collection of fragmented memories. This was live, a raw, unfiltered feed of pure, escalating panic. The choral echo in his neural pathways, once a quiet archive, had just become an open receiver pointed at a screaming mob. He pushed off the pillar, trying to move, to fight his way to the edge of the crowd. But every person he brushed against was a new torrent of agony. A shove from a burly technician sent a spike of claustrophobia through him, so intense he could feel phantom walls closing in, taste the stale air of a sealed compartment. A woman grabbing his arm to steady herself flooded his mind with a blinding image of her daughter's face, a wave of desperate protective love so powerful it made him gasp. It was too much. The individual voices dissolved. They bled into one another, rising in pitch and volume, until they were no longer words, just raw sonic emotion. A single, multifaceted scream of terror that existed only inside his skull. It was a physical force. It hit him like a wall of water, buckling his knees. He staggered, catching himself on a rusted railing. His vision swam, the orange lights of the hub smeared into streaks, the faces in the crowd melting into waxy, screaming masks.
He could taste their fear. It was the sharp, metallic tang of blood and ozone, the bitterness of adrenaline on the back of his tongue. He could feel their despair as a physical weight, the crushing pressure of the abyss itself settling onto his shoulders, driving the air from his lungs. It was a drowning, but not in water. He was drowning in people. He saw flashes, thousands of them, superimposed over reality like shattered glass. A memory of a ration queue, suddenly suffused with the terror that the food would run out. A memory of a lover's embrace, now laced with the horrifying certainty that they would die here, together. A memory of looking at a pressure gauge, the needle twitching into the red, the fear of a breach so potent it made Jorin's own skin crawl with the phantom sensation of cold, seeping water. These weren't his memories. They were everyone's. They were happening all at once. The choir of fear. That's what it was. A symphony of damnation with 1,000 screaming vocalists, and his mind was the concert hall. Urgh! The sound was ripped from his throat, a pathetic noise completely swallowed by the external pandemonium. He stumbled away from the railing and fell, his hands skidding on the perpetually damp floor. He was on his hands and knees in the middle of the Sump transit hub, head bowed, body trembling. Around him, the panic was reaching its zenith. Fights were breaking out. People were clawing at the unmoving bulkhead, their fingernails scraping uselessly against the hardened metal. But for Jorin, that was all distant, muffled noise. The real storm was inside. He was losing himself. His own fear, his own identity, his own desperate need to find a quiet corner of the city. It was a single drop of rain in a tidal wave. The memory of his daughter, Lyra, the ghost that had defined him for years, was being washed away, diluted by the fears of 1,000 strangers for their own children. He tried to cling to her face, her voice, the suffocating memory of the water taking her. It had been his anchor in grief, the terrible foundation of his life. Now it was just another scream in the choir.
He collapsed fully, his cheek pressed against the cold, grimy deck plate. The psychic onslaught was absolute. It was a pure, white-hot agony of the soul. He was no one, just a vessel for the collective terror of the Sump. He felt a man's heart attack, a blinding pain in his chest and left arm. He felt a young woman's asthma attack, her lungs seizing, a desperate, rasping fight for air. He felt the sheer, mindless panic of a dozen others, a stampede of thought that trampled everything in its path. This is it, he thought, a final lucid fragment of his own mind. This is how I die. Not in a breach, not in the crushing deep, but here, drowned on dry land, drowned in the fear of others. His body convulsed. The world went black, then white, then a nauseating, flickering gray. The screaming in his head didn't stop. It just changed. It was as if a filter was slowly being applied. The raw, chaotic agony began to organize itself. The noise was still there, a deafening roar, but he could start to perceive its shape, its texture. It wasn't just noise anymore, it was information. He saw the layout of the hub not as a physical space, but as a map of emotional intensity. He saw the vectors of panic, the epicenters of despair. He saw the weak points in the crowd's morale, the exact places where a single word could start a riot or bring a moment of calm. He lay there, twitching on the floor of the sealed-off hub, a piece of human wreckage amidst the chaos. But his eyes, wide open and staring at nothing, were beginning to see everything. The final shudder of the bulkhead bore still echoed in the bones of the corridor. Hestian held up a hand, a gesture of stillness that flowed through the half-dozen ragged figures behind him. They were the husks of the Sump, the echo touched, their faces gaunt under the sickly orange glow of the emergency sodium lamps. Their eyes wide and dark, fixed on him, their anchor in the sudden, terrifying cage of their own world. Jorin, the welder, was somewhere else in this maze, a frantic spark. Hestian's flock, however, was here, with him. Deep and safe, he murmured, the words of familiar balm. His own voice was a low hum, a counter-frequency to the panic that radiated from them like heat. Breathe with the hull. It still holds us. A young woman named Ilara,
her knuckles white where she gripped the hand of a boy no older than 10, shook her head. "The noise, Hestian, it's gone."
He didn't need to be told. The realization had already settled deep in his gut, a block of ice in the warm, symbiotic tide of the chorus within him. For his entire life, the Sump had been a symphony of industry. The deep-frequency thrum of the geothermal turbines, the ceaseless groan of stressed metal, the chugging rhythm of the reclamation pumps. Now, nothing. The silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of a severed limb. It was the sound of abandonment. He turned his head slowly, his one good eye scanning the dripping, rust-stained walls of the maintenance corridor. His other eye, the one touched by the abyss, saw the world differently, a shimmering overlay of faint green-gold light, the signature of the choral echo. It clung to the damp patches of fungi like ghostly moss. It was a language he was only just beginning to read. "The Spireborn have cut the power," Hestian said, his voice remaining level. "And the water." A collective gasp, sharp and desperate. The boy, Cale, pulled on Ilara's hand. "I'm thirsty." "We all are, little spark," an older man rasped, his face a road map of weld burns and worry. "Rust rot. What are we supposed to do?" Hestian didn't answer immediately. He was listening past their fear, past the ringing in his own ears. He was listening to the new sound of the Sump. And there it was. A sound so small it would have been swallowed by the normal cacophony. Drip, drip. He pushed past Ilara gently, his gaze fixed on a junction of pipes 20 feet down the corridor. Wires hung like dead metallic vines around a thick algae-coated conduit, a secondary reclamation line, one of the old ones, barely used. The lockdown, the sudden shift in pressure when the main bulkhead slammed shut, must have done it. A hairline fracture, invisible to the naked eye. Drip. The sound was a tiny, insistent nail being hammered into the coffin of the Sump. He moved closer, his followers trailing behind him like uncertain ghosts. The floor grate beneath the pipe was slick, a small dark puddle slowly expanding. Hestian knelt, his augmented eye flaring as he focused. The water was not clear. It was a murky grayish fluid, thick with particulates. It had an oily, almost pearlescent sheen under the emergency lights. But to his other eye, it was blinding. It was not water. It was life. It was a concentrated solution of the choral echo, raw and unfiltered, drawn straight from the foundations and now seeping into their sealed environment. The chorus in his mind, usually a gentle oceanic hum of shared memory, surged into a roar. He felt the echo of 1,000 drowning moments held suspended in that single swelling drop. "Water!" Cale cried, his voice sharp with a child's simple need. He broke from Ilara's grasp and scrambled toward the puddle. "Look!" "No!" Ilara shouted, lunging for him. But Hestian was faster. He didn't raise his voice. He simply moved, placing his body between the boy and the spreading contamination on the floor. He put a hand on Cale's small chest, a touch that was both firm and impossibly gentle. "Not that water, little spark, not yet." Cale looked up at him, confused and afraid. "But it's water. We need it." Hestian looked from the boy's innocent, thirsty face to the faces of the others. He saw their desperation, the primal urge to cup their hands and drink from the spreading pool of poison. This was not the gentle path he had found, the slow, symbiotic merging over years in the whispering gills.
This was a flood, a forced baptism. Praxilla, in her sterile rage, had just created the perfect petri dish. She had locked them in with the god of the abyss and given it a weapon. The dawning horror was not for himself. He had already crossed the threshold. It was for them, for the thousands of other hall clingers trapped in the sump who would feel the thirst and find these leaks. They wouldn't understand. They would fight it. And the echo, when fought, did not retreat. It dissolved. It erased. Drip. The drop hit the puddle, and Hestian's glowing eye saw the ripple not as disturbed water, but as a pulse of consciousness spreading outward. A memory flared in his mind, unbidden, not his own. The taste of salt, the crushing weight, the terror of a woman named Anya as her submersible's cockpit imploded 60 years ago. He winced, pushing it down.
"That is not just water," he said, his voice taking on the cadence of a priest explaining a terrible sacrament. He looked at each of them, forcing them to meet his mismatched gaze. "The spire has cut us off from the filtered cycle. This is the tide itself, unstrained, the deep song in its purest form." The old welder shook his head, uncomprehending. "What are you talking about, Hestian? It's a leak. It's dirty water." "No," Hestian corrected softly, his focus returning to the next drop as it gathered at the fracture, heavy and pregnant. "It is an answer, just not to the prayer we were making." He stood up, turning his back on the mesmerizing, lethal drip. He faced his small, terrified flock, trapped between the silent, unmoving bulkheads and a thirst that would drive them mad. The calm he had projected was gone, replaced by a grim, chilling certainty. His purpose had just been made terrifyingly clear. He was no longer just a guide for the willing. He was now the shepherd for the damned, and his job was to teach them how to drown without screaming. Drip. "What do we do?" Alara whispered, pulling Kale tight against her leg. "Hestian, what do we do now?" Hestian looked at the spreading, shimmering puddle, then back at their faces. The horror had fully bloomed, cold and absolute, but his voice was steady. "Now," he said, the word falling into the silence with the weight of a sinking stone, "we learn to listen."